Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Consciousness Engineering with Brainmaster Jim Kwik. Not only does Jim have the world's largest collection of shirts with brains on them, but Jim is also the creator of Superbrain, which was Mindvalley's most popular program in 2017. We had more people enroll in Superbrain than any other program that year, and that's because Jim is a really unique guy. Jim is the brain coach for many of the world's top performers. He has trained the cast of the upcoming X-Men movie. He trains Will Smith. He has been invited to SpaceX to train Elon Musk, Musk's kids, and the staff at SpaceX. Brilliant people around the world rely on this man to teach them how to use their brains more efficiently. And so I'm so honored, Jim, to have you speaking directly to Mindvalley's biggest members.
Oh, it's a real honor to be here, and because I know you are the ones that are making this happen. And I feel like it's kindred spirits and kindred minds, people who really are committed to growth and to giving. And so I love being here. Thank you.
So many of you may have seen the amazing podcast episode I did with Jim Kwik, where he spoke about speed reading, right? It was a slightly longer than normal podcast, and Jim blew people away with his ideas on how to read a book in 90 minutes flat.
Yeah.
But I realized that for you, our unique audience, there's so much more that you may want to ask Jim. So here in front of camera, we're going to go deeper in more of Jim's advanced learning techniques.
I'm excited, and maybe we could start with speed reading. Because we do some of the basics and the fundamentals, and some of you may be familiar with the fundamentals of using a visual pacer and such, but what I really want to, maybe we could focus on is smart reading. You know, how to get more out of your reading. Because here's the challenge. A lot of people read something, and not only will they forget it, they just won't understand what they're reading. And we get to work with, as you mentioned, some pretty high-level clientele, whether they are politicians or they run businesses, and anyone, whether you're a student to a senior, anyone in between, everyone can benefit from being a better reader, because leaders are readers. And so I want to talk about how do you boost your comprehension? Because all of us can get more out of it. I mean, we could meditate on a line on a book for like our whole life and get more and more value out of it. So there's never a point where you get 1,000 or 100% comprehension. You could always get more, and you would never read any faster than you would actually understand something. But there are some really good strategies for getting more out of what you read. And I think for people watching right now, because you're on the cutting edge of personal development, because you go out there and buy books, and you just don't want them sitting there. And even if you are reading them, I bet you could get even more out of it than you normally would. And so maybe we could start there.
That would be fantastic. So some of you watch the podcast. That's great.
Okay.
Here, we're going to go a lot deeper.
Absolutely. So the really quick review, if you didn't watch the podcast, and I still recommend you do that still, is there's a difference between scanning, skipping words, and actually reading something. And so we focus on everything that has to do with reading and studying. And so I'm going to show you how to really master technical material, because that's the material you really want to do. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have something fiction and light. You could read that slowly. You could sound out the words, because that's your own prerogative, because you're doing it for enjoyment. But what about the things that are very technical? What about the things that have to do with coding? What about the things having to do with personal growth and the neuroscience or spirituality, things that are much more rich? How do you get more out of it? So going back, I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but just as a refresher, to help you to read faster, I always recommend using a visual pacer, okay? And the reason why is because it boosts your reading speed, and not only your speed, but your focus, 25 to 50%. And it's just using your finger or a highlighter, a pen, pencil, a mouse on a computer, because your eyes are attracted to motion and it pulls you through. So that's a fundamental brain hack that we talked about on the specific podcast episode.
So let me get a book and a pencil.
Perfect.
So that you can demonstrate this.
Let's do that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. There you go, Jim.
Now, this is one of my favorite books ever. So, yes.
Stop it. You're just saying that. Of course, it's also because I mentioned you at page 99.
This is true, 99. All right, so let's say this is a book, and it's technical. It's information that you don't want to just scan or skip. You really want to absorb this information. And so we're going to go through this. Okay, so let's say I want to read this book. I'm going to use my pen or a finger or a pencil in this case as a visual pacer. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to underline, I'm not going to write in the book, but I'm just going right above it. So it works on digital devices also. So if you're on your Kindle, if you're on your iPad or whatever you're reading with, you're not touching the screen or writing on the screen. And I'm just going right below the lines. Now, generally though, a more advanced technique that we didn't talk about the podcast is I like to train people to actually use their opposite hand, which for most people actually that's usually in their left hand. Even if you're left-handed, I like people using their left hand. And the reason for this is because you learned in high school biology that one side of your brain controls the opposite side of your body, right? God forbid you know somebody who has a stroke on their left side of their brain. If there's paralysis, it manifests on the right side of their body, because anything below the neck, it goes opposite, right? And so we know that there's a brain-body connection. And what science is telling us is there's also a body-brain connection, that using different parts of your body actually stimulates different parts of your brain. Now, why do you want to use your left hand? It's because when you're using your left hand, it actually stimulates the right side of your brain, the right hemisphere of your brain. Now, why is that important when it comes to reading? Well, it's extremely important, and I'll tell you why, is because your left side you learn in science. Now, it's much more complicated, this, but as a summary, right, as a 30,000 view, is your left side is more logical. It's more words. It's more language. It's linear, the progression of words. It sounds like your subvocalization that we talked about in the podcast. That's left brain. So for most people, reading is a left brain process. But we get to test people all around the world, right? Doing these events, speaking on stage, and with our online programs and our podcast, we find that the best readers are actually not left brain, they're more right brain, or at least more whole brain. And what I mean by that is your left side is logical, your right side is what? It's more creative, it's more imagination, it's more visualization, it's more emotion. And the reason why that's important when it comes to reading is you want to be able to activate those functions while you read. So you're not just hearing the words, you're actually experiencing the words. So for example, I remember I had one of my students approach me. I was going for a walk, came up to me and said, "Jim, I have a great story for you. I recently reread one of the books that I was reading during your course, and the second time I read the book after the course, it was completely different." And I was like, "What book was it?" He was like, "It was The Old Man and the Sea." And I was like, "Oh, Hemingway, that's great." But he was like, "It was totally different the second time." And I was like, "Well, I don't think Hemingway updated the book recently. You know, how was it different?" He was like, "After the course, it was really different. It was like, I felt like I was in the book." He said,
Wow.
I could hear the ocean waves. I could feel the sand beneath my toes. He said, "The one thing I didn't like was the smell of the fish." And that really is a full experience. And that's really happening more in your right side of your brain.
But what was going on there?
So what's happening is, so have you ever been so into a book, it's like because here's the thing, Spielberg and Lucas, they can't do what you could do in your mind, right? I had an event recently, and in the audience was Don Miguel Ruiz, right? Like, you know, and I know you're close with him, and I brought him on stage because I wanted him to say a few words, and I asked him this question. I was like, "What's your superpower?" And he's like, "Jim, my superpower is like everybody's superpower. It's like the power of my imagination." And we all know that imagination is more powerful than knowledge, because knowledge is what is, and imagination really is what could be. But when we're talking about, it's incredible, what AR and virtual reality and all this stuff that's going on with technology, it's still, the inner technology you have is so powerful, and we're just scraping the surface of what we're capable of. And so, have you ever read a book and you feel like you're in the book?
Right.
Like you're walking around with it, you can't put it down, people are talking to you and you don't even pay attention? To help you to be able to do that consciously, instead of just hoping it shows up, is stimulating the right side of your brain. And so one of the ways of doing that is actually using the left side of your body. Because as we know, the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of the body. But by using your left side, actually stimulates different parts of your right side of your brain, which helps you to be able to access potentially some of those functionalities of your imagination, your creativity, and so on.
So let me try to put this together.
Yeah.
So in the podcast episode, which I do recommend you guys have watched before we come to this advanced lesson, Jim spoke about 5 ways to speed up your reading, right? Now, the first one was the understanding that we don't really upgrade our style of reading since we learn to read. Most of us learn to read between the ages of 4 to 6, and then we stop. And we never ever focus on improving our reading speed. And it's crazy, our education system doesn't teach this. Now, the second thing is understanding, and Jim explains really well in the podcast why when you speed up your reading, your comprehension goes up, it doesn't go down. And this is counterintuitive to what most of us believe. Many of us believe if we speed up our reading, our comprehension goes down, and so we do not dare speed up our reading. But when you realize, and Jim breaks it down for you in the podcast, that comprehension goes up with speed, you open your eyes to the possibility of what is possible with reading. Now, the third is the idea of, what do you call it?
Subvocalization.
Subvocalization.
Yeah.
We learn to say the words as we are reading them, but that slows us down because our mouth can only move at a certain speed. Fourth is the idea of
going back and we're kind of like rereading words.
Rereading,
yeah,
right.
Yeah, we call it regression. It's like you're back skipping, you're reading, and I bet a lot of people could experience that. Have you ever read something you read the same line over and over again? It's just a bad habit that we picked up.
It's back skipping, and we unconsciously do it. And this is where pacing works. This is why the pencil is so important. It actually speeds up your reading because it prevents back skipping. The fifth idea that Jim shared is simply the belief model that you can speed up your reading. Okay, so now we are zeroing in on the pacing bit, and Jim is going deeper to show you how with pacing, you don't just speed up your reading, but you can actually make your whole experience richer by activating the right side of your brain.
And so what we're doing here is we talked about in the podcast episode that using a visual pacer will boost your reading speed 25 to 50% across the board. And the best thing you could do right now is to test it for yourself, is to read for 60 seconds, pause, leave a line in the margins, and count the number of lines you just read. And then read actually using the visual pacer. And this time for comprehension, and then count the number of lines after 60 seconds. And that second number for most people will be a 25 or 50% greater number. And so that's an instantaneous brain hack that will boost your productivity and your performance. Now, you can just get better at it just through practice, right, by using your finger. And we also talked about a brain hack that instead of going margin to margin all the way, that we know that your peripheral vision could actually see maybe a word to the left and a word to the right. So you don't have to go margin to margin. You could actually just go and maybe indent yourself a little bit, a word or two, because your peripheral vision will pick up on what's on the left and what's on the right, so you don't have to take the time. So all of those little hacks might seem like a little bit when you're going through one page, but when you're going through a chapter or a book or many books, it really, really adds up. As we talked about in the podcast, the average person has to read about 4 hours a day, emails and websites and blogs and all this information. If you could double your reading speed, save 2 hours a day or even 1 hour a day. We equated 1 hour a day equals 9 40-hour work weeks over the course of a year, 2 months of productivity. So that's the gift you could give to yourself, to your family, to your body, the things that really, really matter. And so now what I'm asking you to do in this advanced group is try using your left hand, even if you're left-handed. Because what I'm saying to you is to test this out to yourself, is that if you want to activate more of your right side of your brain, the creative side, the more imaginative, if you have trouble visualizing and understanding it, then stimulate the left side of your brain. In fact, there was a book called Keep Your Brain Alive. And I've been teaching it this way for over 20 years, using your left hand to activate your right brain. And it talks about the research. So this doctor, Dr. Lawrence Katz, was doing research with seniors, wanted to find out how to keep their brains alive into their 80s, 90s, and above, and narrowed it down to simple lifestyle changes, like brushing your teeth with your opposite hand, or eating with the opposite hand, or showering with your eyes closed, if you can do that safely. Because when you cut off one of the senses, it forces you to really develop and enhance your other senses, right? And so part of it has to do with, for example, using your left hand while you read to help stimulate the right side of your brain so you can be more creative, imaginative. So for example, when I first learned these skills, there was a movie that was out. It was with Tom Cruise, and he played a lawyer for the mob, and it was called The Firm, right? And a bunch of friends wanted to go out one Friday night to see this movie, and I was like, oh, I haven't read the book yet. And I don't know if anyone's had this experience before. It's like you want to see the movie, but you haven't read the book yet, and you never get to the books, you never get to watch the movie, and so on, right? So friends, peer pressure is like, come on out, and on the way out, I just grabbed the book on the way out. And then we go to the movie theater, and they're like, should we buy you a ticket? I'm like, holding the book, I'm like, you know what, I really want to read this book. So I sit, and they go into the movie theater, I sit in the lobby, and I start the book. I finish the book, and then they come out of the theater a little while later, and I was like, how's the movie? And they were like, it was so-so, not so great. It wasn't great, it wasn't that bad, but it wasn't that great. And they were like, how's the book? I was like, the book was really good. John Grisham, I love this book. Even if you listen to the interview he did with Charlie Rose, they're like, what they do to my book, right? And so never judge a book by its movie, all right? Never judge a book by its movie, I always tell people. But the book was so much better, and it often is better, because again, nobody could compress it into a 2-hour movie, what you could do inside your mind. And that's the thing when you're reading. And so I would say use your left hand while you read. And so now this is the thing, when you use your left hand, if you're not left-handed, it might feel awkward, it might feel different. And it's equivalent of, here's a perfect example. So growing up in school, I was never that that I didn't achieve very much. I had this learning disability, as everyone knows. The only class I was successful in all of school was typing. And the reason why is when I would visit my grandparents, they didn't have any toys. The only thing they had was a rusty, dusty typewriter. And so I would only be able to entertain myself by typing on that typewriter. Now, when I got to middle school where they had a typing class, they're like, okay, just free. Just enjoy it, just play with it for a week. And I was the best typer, and it was so cool, Vishen, because they would put my name on the board, and it was Jim Quick, and I was the fastest typer, and they put my words per minute there, and that's how actually you do reading is words per minute also, as I measure reading speed, and I was the best, and it was so amazing. So for the first time, I was good at something academically. And then a week later, a teacher was like, okay, we're going to teach you how to type, and I was like, I want to take this test so badly. I want to do well and be the top of the class. This is my dream. And she's like, I know how to type. I want to take the test. She's like, no, it's not actually using the 2 fingers like I was doing, because I invented this 2-finger method, right? This hunting and pecking. And so she's like, no, Jim, you have to use all 10 of your fingers, and there's these home keys and everything. And I was like, I tried it, and then what do you think happened to my typing speed? It went down. It went really down because it was awkward and it was weird and it felt uncomfortable. And so what do? I didn't want to lose that top ranking, so I just keep on using my 2 fingers, right? Anyway, my friends, because they didn't know, they just started using their 10 fingers. And an interesting thing happened. After a week or 2, what happened? I was number 1, but after a couple weeks, what happened? I started to fall. I was number 3, and number 6, and number 10. I kept on falling. And then after a while, I was in the bottom 10%. And it took my slow brain all those weeks to understand something really that's fundamental. I was like, that's not fair. They're using 5 times more fingers. So I had to work 5 times harder going like this when somebody could just go like this. And so what I'm saying is, if you use your left hand and you're not left-handed, you might have to take a step back, just like I did with now I'm a fast typer, but I had to take a step back in order to take leaps forward. So that's the difference. And here's the thing with achievers, because everyone who's watching this, you're in an elite group, right? A unique tribe membership area here, is that I remember, and I'm going to drop a couple names, so I hope that's okay. And I do this not to drop names as much as I do to make it memorable. So a few years ago, there was a big boxing match, and I'm not really big into boxing, but I like athletics because I like seeing people perform and compete at the highest level, because I think excellence, you can role model that, right? And I get a call. It was Mayweather versus Pacquiao, and for those people who watch boxing, they know that it was the biggest fight by far of the decade. I get a message from Sylvester Stallone saying, you want to come watch the fight at my house? And I'm like, do I want to watch a boxing match at Rocky's home? And I was like, yes, I'll be there. And I show up there, and I'm sitting on the couch watching it on his theater, and it's me, Sylvester Stallone, and I swear to you, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And if somebody, again, took a picture of that couch, people would be like, who photoshopped that Asian dude in that photo? But afterwards, the boxing match was lackluster. It wasn't that great. But afterwards, I believe genius leaves clues. And I asked both of them, I'm saying, what does it take to be a champion? What does it take to play at that level? Not for the $300 million or whatever they were competing for. What does it take to get to that place? And I'll always remember what Arnold said. He said, Jim, the difference between an amateur and a champion is a champion has the ability to push past the pain period. The champion can push past the pain period. And my message to everyone watching is sometimes transformation is not necessarily all the time elegant. It's not always that easy. But in order to be able to push your body through a certain level of intensity, sometimes through the challenges of your business, the challenge of your relationship, the challenge of anything, sometimes we have to get stronger. That failure is not necessarily the opposite of success, but maybe failure is a part of success, that we go through struggle to develop strength. And so what I would say is, you could use your left hand and not feel comfortable and go back to using your right hand, and that's fine. But if you want the highest level rewards, which I know a lot of you do because you participate in all of the programs that Mindvalley has to offer, I would push past the pain period, and that's how we grow. And so get used to getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and maybe it could serve you in this context of using your left hand and develop that skill. So now you're using your left hand and you're activating your right side of your brain, you're going to get more comprehension. Now, while you're doing this, and all you're doing again is I'm just underlining the words, going from left to right, and I'm not skipping anything. Traditional speed reading is more scanning, skipping words. They'll take their finger and go down the page, or make S forms or Z forms. The problem is you miss big gaps, and that's why people get the gist of what they read. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying keep your posture up. You keep the book so you can see it straight on, so you're not minimizing an angle here, like the size of the words, and you're just underlining the words like this. Now, how do you boost comprehension? There's 3 keys to boosting your comprehension. I'm gonna give you 3 quick tips, and this is fundamental, and these are very foundational to it. And you could say they're common sense, but they're not common practice. And so remember 3 R's. There's 3 R's for reading comprehension, okay? The first R is you have to read. Okay, so that's a no-brainer. You can't comprehend something unless you actually read it first. The thing with the reading, though, because we know readers are leaders, the key, though, is to use your left hand, is to underline the words, and then also schedule it. Because if you don't schedule it, most people want to meditate, they want to journal, but if they don't put it in their calendar, it doesn't get done. And when I write things down in my calendar, I treat it as time with a big client, or time with an investor, or time, something you would never cancel with anybody, right? So you schedule it in your reading. The second R, when it comes to comprehension, is you want to relate. You want to relate. And here's really what it comes down to. I believe that questions are the answer. I believe questions are the answer. That most people, when they read, independent of the velocity of how fast they read, most people don't get comprehension because they don't have they don't have questions. So one of the fundamental tips for standardized test, right? You have reading comprehension. A lot of people read paragraphs, pages and pages of paragraph, and at the end, they'll see the 10 questions that the creator of this test wants you to answer. So the really easy brain hack to be able to circumvent that is to be able to ask the questions first, right? Read the questions first and then read the passages so you know, oh, there's an answer, there's an answer, there's an answer. Because otherwise, what are you looking for, right? Now, I would never pick up a book without questions to be able to ask, because that's a problem. If you don't have questions, you're not going to get an answer. Because you have part of your brain, it's called the reticular activating system, the RAS, and it determines what you focus on in your nervous system. So for example, years and years ago, my younger sister, she was sending me emails and postcards, pictures of this type of dog, like a pug dog, like a small little fawn dog with a smushed in face that you could, you put in costumes and all kinds of things. And I didn't know why she was sending me these pictures, but I realized her birthday was coming up. And I realized that that's what she wanted for her birthday gift. And a funny thing happened, Vishen. When I was running around my neighborhood, I was going to the grocery store. I went to the grocery store and somebody was carrying a pug dog. I was running and doing my regular jog, and this person, I swear to you, this guy was walking 6 pug dogs. And now, I never saw these pug dogs before, but did they just magically appear all of a sudden? Where were they? They were always there. But why didn't I see them? It's because I wasn't paying attention for them. Because at any given moment, there are literally billions of stimulus you could pay attention to. And the reason why we don't is primarily your brain is a deletion device. Your brain is a deletion device because if you paid attention to everything, you would go stark mad, right? So primarily you're trying to delete it, the things that aren't important. You're trying to filter them out. But when something becomes important, like that pug dog, you get a curiosity about it, you start seeing it everywhere. There are pug dogs in this book, meaning there are answers in this book. And when you're reading this book, if you don't have questions, you're not going to see them, but they're right in front of you all the time. But as you're speed reading information, it's coming into you at light speed, right? Then you're like, oh, there's an answer, there's an answer, there's an answer. Because questions act like a magnet.
So phrase the questions before you start reading the book.
Absolutely, and you make them very explicit.
But, okay, let's say I'm reading a book right now about the Pixar company, right? By John Lasseter, about how he created Pixar. What type of questions do I ask before reading the book?
Perfect. And so what we do is we do a drill, right? And I'll map this out for everybody here. The first, what we're doing is we're actually writing explicit questions. So when I go through technical information, more technical, like a business book or a book on psychology, I'll go through and so everybody knows that there's a learning curve. What a lot of people don't know is there's a forgetting curve. That within 48 hours, you can lose up to 80% of what you remember, you initially learned, because there's a big steep drop in terms of your retention. And so that's what happens in school. a lot of people didn't study back in school. What they did was they crammed, right? They didn't study for weeks, and then they cram all night. They pull on all-nighter, which is really bad for your memory. And then next morning, nobody could talk to you because you don't want any information to fly out or fall out at breakfast, and you can't wait to take the test, because once you take the test, what happens? All the information is just, it's gone, right? Because you forgot it all. And so there's a difference between cramming to forget and studying to remember. Now, if you want to just forget information because it's a one-time thing, that's fine. But if you need to recall that information for the rest of your life, then you want to go through a certain step. So for example, let's say you learn something and you get it at 65%, but then in a couple of days, that forgetting curve hits and it goes down to 5%, metaphorically. You say you review that information the second day, and instead of 60 or 65%, it jumps up to 75%, but then it falls, but it doesn't fall quite to the 5%, it falls maybe to 10%. And you're like, ooh, this is you could be very jaded. You learn something and it's gone a couple days. But what happens is after two or three times, you get to this place where you get this aha, this aha phase, where I think that's what Oprah calls it, this aha, this eureka, where it doesn't go down, it consolidates, short-term, long-term memory, and integrates, and from there it actually just starts building. You start to understand. Your brain sees it 3 or 4 times. You're like, okay, this is important. I'm going to build on this. And it starts to go up, right? And so what do you do with that? Knowing that's the case, what do you do? Well, I would say you could go through information really simple. You don't even read it. I would say the first thing you do in a chapter like that is I would go through the chapter and I would actually do this. Before you start your journey, before we had GPS and Google Maps and everything, how would we drive from here to there? What would we have to go out and buy? We would have to buy a map, right? And so I would say make a map. And so what I do with technical material is I actually make a metaphorical map. And what's that map composed of? Well, first of all, the first thing that I would do is I would actually go through and I would write down the vocabulary words in that chapter. And everybody could do this. It's actually really straightforward because good books, some books will actually be designed for it. They'll actually highlight some of the words because sometimes in order to get better comprehension, if you just knew what the vocabulary meant, you would know a good portion of comprehension of what that is, because it's kind of like if there's a wall of comprehension, those bricks are the vocabulary, right? And so what I would do is I would go through the chapter and I would, on a piece of paper, write down the vocabulary words. Now, if they aren't provided, sometimes they're provided or they're underlined or they're italics or they're bolded, you can write them down. And even if they're not written down, can you go through a page and just write down the words you don't know what they are? Scan through them without reading. Of course you can. In fact, some of the best spellers do this naturally. Like I'll tell you, like in the Superbrain, we go through a whole how to remember. I train a lot of the spelling bee champions, right? And the wrong way to learn how to be able to spell is phonetically, especially in the English language, because a lot of words aren't spelled phonetically. Even the word phonetically isn't spelled phonetically, right, in the English language. So, but Spanish is a lot different. Spanish, a lot of the words are spelled phonetically. But the challenge is the best actual spellers, where they don't use an auditory strategy, they use a visual kinesthetic strategy. Meaning, Vishen, have you ever looked at a word visually and felt like it's spelled wrong? Like you look at it and it just feels like yucky, it feels like it's off, it feels weird. That's a visual kinesthetic strategy, and that's what the best spellers use, right? And so you could use that same strategy looking at a page in a book and notice the words that are unfamiliar to you, because you'll get that same feeling in your body and you just write down those words. That's the first part of the map.
Got it. That's a powerful tip.
Absolutely. And so those, you make them explicit. Now notice, I'm gonna give an abridged version of this. The second thing I would do is write down all the questions. And so what you could do actually even before that, I'll give you another tip. Look at all the pictures. Look at all the pictures. Now, not all books have pictures, but I would say what I'm looking for is anything that's not text. So as you're scanning through a book and you're going through it, right, anything that pops out in your mind that's not text-driven. So what would that qualify? You're talking about photos. You're talking about illustrations. You're thinking about charts. You're thinking about graphs. Anything that's not text-based, I would just look at the image. Now, what are you doing here? You're creating your map. You're getting a big overview of the chapter. You're seeing the words that are key for it, and also you're seeing the big images. And a picture is worth what?
1,000 words.
1,000 words, right? And here's the thing. When you're looking at the words and you're looking at the images, you might not know what these things are. And in fact, if it's a book on quantum physics or it's a book on, you might not even know what these business terms are. And what do? You automatically prompt questions. So you're looking at the images, you're writing down the words, and all of a sudden, you don't know what that chapter is about, but you're priming your brain. So it's not the first time you're looking at this information. And all of a sudden, unconsciously, just like the pug dogs, you're like, what is that? What does that graph mean? What does that mean that you're seeing the photo, and you might have 20 or 30% comprehension, but the brain needs closure. Your brain hates open loops. So it's gonna kind of keep an open mind. Like what I'll do is I'll take a paper clip, right? And I'll put it in my hands like this. And I'll ask somebody, which hand do you think the paper clip is in? Which hand do you think the paper clip is in? And they might say left hand or right hand. Maybe you could do this at home. Which hand do you think it's in? You say it's left, my left or your left, this health, right? And you do that. And all it is, and I don't have a paper clip, right? And here's, it's kind of interesting. It's just a paper clip, but all of a sudden, by you making an investment in the answer of it, you get very invested in the answer. And so when you're going through it, you don't know the words, you don't know the pictures, but all of a sudden, you're emotionally a little bit invested in it more than you were, and that's the key to active learning. Most learning is passive, and that's why you can't learn. It's because learning is not a spectator sport. And most people just hopefully they'll just absorb it and consume it. Your brain doesn't learn by consumption, it learns through creation, right? And so you need to imagine, you need to get involved, you need to ask questions. So you're going through step one, you're writing down all the words. In step two, you're looking at all the images, and you don't know what those images are, but you're kind of seeing the landmarks on this map. We're taking a road trip all together from here to there. You're kind of seeing some of the things to stop by, the scenic sites and so on.
Now, Jim, when we're talking about a non-fiction book, you mentioned earlier about reading the book The Firm,
yes.
right? How would you create questions for a fiction book?
Perfect. So for fiction, actually what I do is I train people actually in fiction reading. Because here's the thing, I train people with the speed reading in fiction reading because my main goal is to get their speed up and then build their comprehension. Now here's the reason why I use fiction reading is because you're not invested in the fiction reading as much as you are nonfiction. Because typically with nonfiction, it's for your work, it's for your personal development, you don't want to miss anything, and so it's hard to teach speed reading in technical material because you'll always want to know what you just missed. And it's really hard sometimes to teach speed if people can't release the attachment to comprehension at first. Now the reason why we practice in fiction reading is this pure practice. And so because you're not vested in that specific information, and if you miss something then that's okay, but it allows you to build the skill base. And then here's the thing, when you chart, we always chart when we test people. And what they'll have is with their fiction reading, it'll start getting better and better and better. And then it'll plateau, just like your body plateaus. And then it'll get better, better, better. And then it'll plateau a little bit like that. Just success, right? It's never a straight line like this. You stretch and you stabilize. You stretch, you stabilize, just like you do with your physical body. Now, the difference though with fiction is we'll train people to ask very specific questions, specifically the 5 W's and the H, right? The who, the what, and the where. And I really focus on 4 of them because I actually map it out in a grid form. I break things down into 4s because I feel like there's a magic to 4. There's a reason why this stool has 4 legs. There's a reason why the pyramids, have the 4 corners that make it very stable. So I break a piece of paper down into a grid. I split it down the center and I split it horizontally and I create a grid. And in each of the quadrants, I have 4 questions. Here I put the what in the quadrant 1, and then in quadrant 2 I put the who, and then in quadrant 3 I put the where, and then here I specifically put the when. Right? And then so when you're reading fiction as a training tool, not that you would ever do this for your pleasure reading, but as a training tool, and we're building the speed with your left hand and imagining everything, you're asking this question. And then afterwards, you're writing in here, oh, what was going on here? Oh, who are the main characters here? In key words, because here's the thing. They've done lots of studies on note-taking, and we covered this in the Super Brain course, the most effective ways of taking notes. And so people should definitely go through that. But one of the tips was the most effective note takers, they don't take word-for-word notes. They capture the key words and the key ideas, right? And so you're capturing the what and the who and the where and the when. And you'll notice though, some people will have a lot of white empty space in the when, and all of a sudden they create another question. Yeah, when is this book taking place? And they start creating like clues. They start looking for pug dogs, like, oh, what what's the technology of the day? What's the automotive models of these cars? What's the languaging, the clothing? So they want to start looking for clues to find out what time period this book takes place.
So
or
who,
where is it?
what, where, when?
Yes.
Is there a why?
Yeah, but I really focus, in terms of a training tool, I focus on these 4 questions because in terms of a plot, most of it we're talking about, who are the main characters, what's the plot that's going on, where is it taking place, and when, right? And so it's training people to answer questions. And the reason why I practice in fiction is all of a sudden you have this loop this progression where you start going from 200 words a minute to 300 words a minute to 350 to 400 to 500 to 800 words a minute. And you'll never read technical information quite as fast, but it acts like a hook. Imagine this is your fiction reading going up here. Your nonfiction reading, your technical reading will never quite be as fast because by definition you're not going to read that technical information as fast. But imagine a hook that kind of drives up. Like there's a hook that's on the fiction reading. So every time you level up your fiction reading, it pulls up your nonfiction reading. The reason why it does it is because it's like a treadmill. It's like the fiction reading is under ideal conditions. Like you're practicing on the fiction reading on a treadmill, and it's training you to your heart rate, it's training your pace and your velocity on a treadmill. So when you're going through life, maybe call that technical reading, out on the thing, you have hills and valleys and you're never quite as fast, but your heart and your body, your muscles are conditioned on that treadmill under perfect conditions. Under perfect conditions, air conditioning, everything else like that. You'll never be in life running that fast, but you're training your organs and your muscles to be able to sustain that. And it acts as a loop because just like as you're training on the treadmill, your heart becomes more efficient, your muscles get more stronger, same thing with your fiction reading, because when you're reading, doing the method we're talking about right here, you're training, you have better focus, you're gonna have less regression, you're gonna spend less time sub-vocalizing, you're building all the good habits with the fiction, and it's gonna be applied towards the nonfiction when you're reading nonfiction reading.
Fantastic. So who, what, when, where?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
So those are the questions.
And Jim, just before you go on, there was something you touched on. And you spent a minute on it, but this was actually something I heard you speak about before, and it changed my reading habits, right?
Yeah.
And it was the idea that you need to schedule time for reading.
Yes.
And so what happened was that I had skipped my reading habit because I was getting so busy. I had so many emails to answer, so much content to create. But then I saw your video on Mindvalley, and you mentioned the idea of scheduling time for reading. And what I did is now I do not go to bed until I've read for about 20 to 25 minutes. So I go to bed at 12:30, I schedule midnight to 12:30 to pick up a book and read. And that has completely changed the number of books I read in a given month.
And that's the thing, little things like that it makes all the difference, right? Because first you create your habits, and then your habits create you. But leaders are readers, right? The average person reads what, 1 book a year, maybe 2 books a year. But we know people, if there's a huge difference between 1 or 2 books a year and 1 or 2 books a week. Right? 1 book a week is 50 plus books a year. I mean, that's like a PhD.
It completely changes you.
Right? Because especially if somebody has a decade of experience or more, and they put it into a book, and you can sit down in a few days and you can download decades into days.
So Jim, next question is, how do you connect information between books? So right now, because we have an A-Fest coming up on longevity, which you're speaking at, I'm reading a ton of books on longevity, right? But I'm trying to connect the dots between these books.
Yeah.
But how do you do it?
Perfect.
How do you connect the dots and remember information?
Perfect. Okay, so we opened this with saying there's 3 keys to comprehension specifically applied towards technical reading. The first thing, we were talking about reading. You have to read the information. The second thing, we were talking about relating. And that's really where you're talking about what you read. And so specifically, let me just close this loop for everybody. What I'm recommending people is people read exactly as Vishen does, 20 minutes a day. You read for 20 minutes, but when you're done, I'm going to ask everybody who's watching this to step up and challenge yourself to do this book a week challenge, right? You read for 20 minutes a day, every single, and then really you could finish a book in a week or 2. 20 minutes a day, even at normal reading speed. And 45 minutes a day on average will get you through 1 book a week, which is amazing. So you read. And then the second thing is you get a partner and you relate and you talk about your book. So you're with somebody who's like, yeah, I can't wait to go out this Friday. Hey, real quick, I'm practicing my reading. Let me tell you about this book I'm reading. And for 2 or 3 minutes, you talk about what you just read. Because something magical happens when you consume information, but you don't just let it stay here, but you teach it to somebody else. You reflect on it, you organize it, because in order for you to talk about what you just read, you're not using the author's word for word verbatim, right, language. What you're doing is you're personalizing it using your own words. And in order to be able to express it out, something happens between when the information goes through your eyes, processed by your mind, to be able to put out in your mouth. And that's where you understand information. So you get a partner and you talk about what you read for 2 or 3 minutes. But to answer your question, the third R for comprehension is writing. And I'm spelling it R-I-T-E just so it fits, because you know I like iteration, right? Everything's an acronym, everything is 4 G's or 3 R's or whatever. The third R for comprehension is writing. And specifically what I do is I map this out for people and I take notes. And what I do is just how I grid out this is the big aha when I teach this, when I grid out the fiction reading and you have the what and the who and the where and the when, it doesn't matter what quadrant it's in, it's training you to organize information in 4s. So what I'm going to ask you to do when it comes to technical information is to do the same thing.